Hi, I hope your Advent is good. This is going to be a little bit on the Feast of the Nativity, Christmas, coming up soon. But I'm also going to cover a little bit before that and lay down some preparation, some groundwork, which is kind of funny because that's exactly the first topic. So when I was young, I remember that when they were doing construction or something, there'd be a sign that said, "Watch this space." And you knew that something was coming, and it was just there to let people know that we're going to build something and whatever, but sometimes it didn't say what it actually was going to be. So anyway, sometimes when we're going to build something, actually anytime we're going to build something, we have to lay out some space. For me, because I'm messy, I have to clear off the table if I want to work on something, building something, or the garage or backyard or someplace. I got to clear some room out first because everything's a mess. But you want to arrange everything, get it all set up. You get your tools in place, get your materials together. You may do the same thing for school projects and other things that you do, hobbies, or even if you're I don't know, doing something else, you clear a space for it maybe. So one of the interesting things is that the people of Israel, to whom Jesus was born into, just as we're born into our families, they were kind of being prepared. And it started out small with Abraham and then built up. And at the beginning, they went through a lot of trials. Man, they went through a lot of problems. But in all that, they were being prepared. Prophets were writing. Stories were being collected. Jesus was born, as many of us are, well, some of us anyway, not so much me, into a very rich tradition, into a kind of culture that had been prepared. And it was a unique one. The Jewish people have never been a large number of the people in the world. So it was kind of preparation. So kind of like, if you're going to build a building, then you clear out some land and maybe, get rid of all the weeds and all the other junk and stuff. And then you go haul away the trash that people have been dumping on this vacant lot or something. And then they come in with graders, and the graders flatten out the earth and make it so that everything is level. And then if you watch them, you'll see that they put some stakes out. And those stakes start to show what the limits of the foundation are going to be, and maybe some key features and things like that, because they've got to handle sewer lines and water supply and maybe underground, if it's electrical underground, they would do that as well. But they work all this stuff out. You'll see them put in wooden forms that go around the foundation. And if you haven't looked at anything like this, go look at one sometime. It's pretty interesting. But the idea is that it starts really with something in the mind of the architect, how it's going to be built, and then it has to be cleared, and then progressively it has to even get ready for the foundation. It's not like the foundation's really the first thing that gets done. So then they have everything all set, then they lay the foundation down. Now, in the scriptures and in our faith, we will refer to Jesus as the foundation, or the cornerstone, or the rock on which, Jesus said to Peter, I declare you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So, it's kind of interesting. Anyway, so think of that. And in the church, a lot of things repeat. And I may have mentioned before, ask me about this if it's interesting to you, because I'd love to tell you more. But repetition sometimes is the way that eternity looks to us that are in time. We do things over and over again because that we're humans and we live in time, and we have to remember and all that too. But with in eternity, to God, it's not a matter of, oh, let's see, what will I do today? Because everything, the time, if God looks at his watch, it's always now. It's always now o'clock. That's the way to put it, I guess. I don't know. Is that funny? Is that cool? I don't know. So the idea is that this foundation is laid down. Jesus then comes at the right time and is born to Mary. I did put a link for you to the story in Luke that describes it all, and I think that's a good thing to read on the birth of Jesus. But also, I wanted to spend a little bit of time. Why did Jesus become man? when he's born, when he was conceived, the feast of the Annunciation, when the Lord announced to Mary that she was chosen, and she said yes. We don't know if anybody said no. But at that point, that's the feast of the Incarnation, because that's when Jesus became one of us in the womb, at that point. But at the Nativity is when he is born, and that's the experience that we've all had. So it further makes Jesus one of us. It's kind of interesting. Jesus was born to become one of us, but then to, in a sense, make us one of him. Yeah? So, because, it's the idea is that now we can be baptized and be a part of that family, a part of the children of God, the church. Why did Jesus have to become man? And I mean, that's God's plan. Okay, that's the easy answer there. But if you think about it, it's kind of an unusual thing. I mean, other religions don't believe this. In Islam, for instance, they believe that Muhammad is the prophet, but not that he's divine. I mean, that would be blasphemy for them. Universally, it doesn't matter which group it is. I mean, they're all pretty solid on that one. For the Jewish people, they don't believe Moses in any way is God. He is simply the great prophet and leader and judge and everything else. Moses was a big deal, the lawmaker. If you look to Buddhism, the idea of the Buddha being reincarnated is not the same thing as divine. And of course, there's the idea that, when somebody has done everything right, some believe that they kind of become like a drop in an ocean and they disappear into the divine in some way and lose, really who they are. But in terms of God coming to us, becoming one of us, this is the only religion. Now, you may have studied that some emperors said that they were divine, certainly in Rome at one point. Not early on, but as soon as they went to empire, it just seems like it was going to go that way, and some were bigger on it than others. But the idea is that it's not, that there's just nothing like this. So if there's nothing else like it, it's really important that we understand the why as much as we can. And you can spend your life meditating on this and praying about it and trying to understand it. And that's a worthwhile thing to do. There's been a lot of leaders that came to us, and famous people, some you haven't heard of, some that are famous you haven't heard of, but some that you have, that told us how to live. And yet the world is still full of wars and all kinds of bad things. And the world stayed largely the same until Jesus came. And it's not something that gets really talked about very much. But the idea is that things really weren't changing. You had the Roman Empire that was big and it was very organized, but it was already, in a sense, it was already starting to decline at the time that Jesus was born. It certainly had lots of power, but once Rome turned from a republic, a kind of democracy in a way, to an empire, and having an emperor who then thinks that he's God in some way, that it was the beginning of the end. That's not the kind of thing that can last. And when you study history of Rome, you'll understand other reasons why Rome declined. Around the same time as Rome, when Jesus was born, was arguably the peak of the Han Dynasty in China, and that lasted a long time. But it really wasn't changing. It was really just about stability, which was something that they really valued. But if you notice in history, after Jesus came, everything really did change. You had another few centuries of the Roman Empire, but it fell. And then you had the beginnings of Europe, and you had what was going on with Muhammad. And just a lot of things were changing. And then people eventually discovered new lands where we live today. And a lot of the science and everything, people really don't always talk about this, but science and literature, so much of the arts bloomed after Jesus came. And you can study that too. But what's undeniable is that seems to have been a trigger for an awful lot of things. Interestingly, it's not always a trigger for good things. Some things that people did, they took some of the gifts that God gave in the faith and didn't use them for a good purpose. And sometimes we do the same. I mean, God gives us 24 hours every day, and we don't always use all those 24 hours the way we should. If we sin, we're certainly using our time and energy, our body, the food that fuels us, we're using it not for the right thing. So the world does that all together. The whole world does that. That's something to think about, is that the problems that we have individually, the world has. The world just has it in a bigger version because it's kind of like adding up all of us. God prepared a people for Jesus to be born into. He prepared a family, he prepared a culture. We would call it context. And he made them different so that Jesus could stand out, because he needed to be in the right place at the right time for all this to work. And of course, he came maybe around the height of the Roman Empire, at a time where everything that happened, it would be boosted. It's kind of like now there's people that get famous because there's internet on TikTok or something. I don't know if anybody really gets famous on that, but you get the idea. There has to be something there to help that along. A while back, the printing press, when they invented the printing press, that changed everything. People could get things printed. A lot of the time, they were pamphlets and brochures and stuff. The American Revolution might never have happened if there weren't printing presses. The Protestant Reformation wouldn't have probably happened without printing presses, with the ability for them to print articles out and distribute them. So it's a good thing to think about for school, because maybe you'll have a project where you can use this. The printing press was very much like the invention of the internet. It happened a little faster, but that's something to think about. So Jesus is born into this time and place, into Israel, which was a Roman possession territory. It was not a province of Rome. It didn't get that dignity. It was not the favored place to be stationed for Roman soldiers or for Pontius Pilate, which came obviously after the birth. So you'll see in the story about Jesus being born that Caesar Augustus called a census. We just went through a census, except then everybody had to go and register in their hometown, and we don't have a lot of details about this, but this happened. That at some point there's a reason why Joseph and Mary went to his home spot, Bethlehem, and then couldn't find any room, and so they ended up having to have Jesus not inside of a house or an inn or a hotel or something like that. So let's look at that a little bit. Why? I mean, it's an interesting story. Everything in the scriptures, almost everything, is going to have some symbolic meaning. Now, there are things in scripture that are just history. This is just what happened. And no, I'm not talking about the scientific thing for Genesis and everything. That's told to have multiple meanings, but you're not supposed to be taking it literally as 6 days. Doesn't mean it can't be. It just means that that's not the point. You're missing the whole point if you get wrapped up in that. But things are symbolic. Things are used for teaching. Things tell us about the nature of our relationship with God when you read Scripture. So look at this. They go to Bethlehem because the authorities, the rulers of the world, say they must. Now, to a reader of Scripture, a lot of the time we look at that and say, okay, this shows how what looks like somebody being a jerk or somebody doing something inconvenient is actually God's will. In some way, this is something that's going to help us if we think that way and if we accept it as something that, if we make it something that helps us. So that's one thing. Interestingly, there was no room at the inn. There was no room for Jesus. Everybody said, we don't have any room for you. You have go have this baby somewhere else because there's no space here. And quite possibly that's really about the way that the world was not expecting Jesus and maybe, in a sense, didn't want him. Because sometimes there's things we need, but we don't want them. I mean, we need to eat our vegetables, but a lot of people don't really like vegetables, and they would just rather eat candy all day or get to their pudding. Or does anybody eat pudding anymore? But, things like that. So there's that as a possible meaning. And if you look around today, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of room for Jesus today. We live in what's called the post-Christian era. It's a time where people have rejected Christ. For a long time, the history of certainly Europe was really driven by Christianity up until the Enlightenment, which is kind of a funny thing. So there you go. So people really aren't always crazy about what they should really want. So that's a topic for you for your response, is you can think about that and tell me something about that, about something that you didn't want, but when you got it, then you realized that you needed it, or something that you just resisted, but it got forced on you in some way, and then afterward you were kind of glad. That would be an interesting topic. So there's that. And then you have, and I'm going to tell you this ahead of time, but you probably already know about it. The Feast of the Holy Innocents comes well after Christmas. And that's because when Jesus was born, you have the Magi, the wise people that go to King Herod and say, hey, we're searching for the new king of Israel. And he goes, hey, I'm the king. What are you doing here? Although he wasn't really the king because the Romans were really in charge, but they just let him play king. So the big deal there is that Herod says, well, I'm going to go fix this right now. He sends the soldiers to go kill all the babies, all the male babies around the age that Jesus would be, all the new ones. And of course, that's a little bit of a hint of what's going to happen with Jesus, that people are going to want to kill him. So the other thing that's interesting about that is that in trying to kill Jesus, in trying to kill God, there's a famous philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, that said, God is dead. Now you can study him someday, and it's an interesting person to study in philosophy. But there's a lot of people that really just want God to go away. And when they are working to make God go away, very frequently they kill other people. And now if you want to go a little deeper, you can start to understand, well, why is it that when somebody really hates God and wants to get rid of God, they very often end up killing a lot of people, not just Christians. They're just so angry. And of course, the answer may very well be, we're made in the image and likeness of God. So if somebody really hates God, they're going to kind of have to hate people, because people are going to remind us of God, even when they don't mean to, even when we don't want them to. Sometimes they do. If you've ever had the experience that somebody reminded you of something that you really didn't want to be reminded about, or somebody annoyed you and then somebody brings them up in the conversation, you go, why did you even have to bring them up? I just don't even want to think about that person. You're in the ballpark of how this could be. So that's another thing you could put in your response if you think of that. So Herod was going after Jesus, but missed the target and just killed a whole lot of babies and did not achieve his goal. And this has pretty much been the story for thousands of years now. So Jesus then goes into Egypt. Mary and Joseph take him into Egypt to escape from Herod. And that's interesting because the Jewish people into which Jesus was born, at some point left their homes and went to Egypt for a while, and then came back to what became Israel. So there you go. So Jesus is personally living out, in a way, the story of the people he's born into. It's like I was telling you before, the things that happen to us happen to all the people in one way or another too. And you can look at this all. I mean, if you think about it, we don't get along with each other sometimes. People get angry, people get in fights, everything else. Well, when that happens with a larger number of people, we call that a war, don't we? So the idea is, really do think about that one. It's kind of cool that that really nations have the problems with each other that we have with each other. The things that happen within our own heart happen elsewhere. The great philosopher, sage Confucius, I won't get the quote exactly right, but said that when there's peace in the soul within the person, that there'll be peace between people, and when there's peace among people and peace in the family, there'll be peace in the village. When there's peace in the village, there's peace in the nation. There's peace in peace in nations. You'd have peace on earth. You'd have peace in the world. We're probably never going to hit that, because there's always going to be people that are going to want to do wrong. That's because we have free will, which we talked about before. People can choose to go wrong. The only way you're going to have a perfect world is if everybody freely chooses to do what's right. And I will leave it to you. Do you think that's very likely? I mean, I don't want to be a pessimist, but on the other hand, we've had a lot of time to work out the problems in the world, and we haven't. And some of us think it's because people sometimes choose themselves over others. They choose their own good over treating other people decently. And that's the choice that we are able to make. I mean, we can choose to be good, but many won't. And it's good for us to have classes like this and to talk to people about things and have discussions and try to spread good things. But some people simply won't buy it. That's just the way life is. So think about that when somebody tells you that they're going to make the world perfect. Probably not, because the only way they're going to... Some people have tried that just by killing off all the people they didn't like, and they thought, well, the people that are left, it'll all be good. It doesn't necessarily work that way, does it? Okay, so we've kind of gone over how God prepared the way and Jesus entered. But again, why did he have to be one of us? And one way to look at that is that with everybody else, we never really saw somebody do it. But Jesus showed us the example close up. The other thing is that, the greatest love that you can really show somebody is to spend time with them. And although God hears our prayers and loves us all the time, I mean, there's never a moment. If there was a moment where he was forgetting about us, we would cease to exist, because he holds us alive. He holds us in existence. God shows us that he loves us by becoming one of us. There have been beliefs in some religions, some that you may not have heard of, some that we covered in the section on St. Augustine, like the Manichees, that believe the human life, is a horrible thing. And if you really look around, you'll see people that say, oh, people are messing everything up. There should be fewer people. We should just give it all back to the animals, and everybody should die. There's actually a group of people that just say it. They just want to die, and it's just really horrible. But for God to become one of us, that's a strong way of saying it's okay to be you. If God would become a human like us, like you, he's saying he's not ashamed to be your brother. He's not ashamed to be a human like you. That's a pretty big deal. You can really think about that one a little bit. That's something you could put in your response. He's saying, I'm not ashamed to be your friend. I'm not ashamed to be your relative. I'm not ashamed for us to be in the same family. And this is done out of love, not out of necessity. Now, if it's done out of necessity for us so that it works, so that we can live better and everything, well, that's love. I mean, what else could you call it when you go out of your way to help somebody else? If you've had a friend that was upset, that had something bad happen, or they just felt sad and you went over and hung out with them to try and cheer them up, to try and just comfort them, or just to be there. One of the nicest things you can say to somebody that's having a hard time is, I'm here. I'm here. What can I do? Can I do anything for you? Do you want to just sit quietly? We can just sit down and watch a movie if you want. Anything like that. To spend time with somebody is love. And that's what God did. He went down and spent time with us. Now, when we get into Lent, then I'll cover why it is that he didn't stay in that form, partly because it wouldn't have been like us if he lived for 2,000 years. On here, that's not the way we live. So it wouldn't be like one of us anymore. We're born, we die. Jesus was born, he died. Because he is the Son of God, he experiences his resurrection of the body right away. 3 days, but right away. And we have to wait because we're in time in a way that he doesn't have to be at some point. All right, so God prepares the way. Jesus is born. It's kind of a sign in many ways that he'll be opposed, that people will want to kill him. But also there's no room for him at the end. People really aren't sure they really want Jesus in their life. So there's that symbolic thing going on there. And the idea that in becoming one of us, it's a great sign of love. And it's unlike anything anybody else has going on. This is totally unique. There's a lot of religions. I've studied quite a few of them. And I can tell you, there's a lot of interesting things. There's nothing like this. There are some that get into space aliens. We don't do that. And you can check that out and everything. But for the most part, this is very earthy. It's very much part of being human, not coming from outer space, not being some crazy emperor that thinks he's more than he is. This is just being one of us. And one last thought, I should have done this earlier. Jesus wasn't born into royalty. He wasn't born to the rich. And they make a big deal out about him being poor, but you have to remember, kind of everybody was poor back then. You live better right now, more than likely, you live better right now than a king 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, kings, everything stunk. There were no flushing toilets. There were no refrigerators. I know some of them had ice they brought down from the mountains and stuff, but really there were no refrigerators. Food was bad a lot of the time. You had to spice it up a lot to cover the bad taste. And if you really study it, you can find all the things that were just horrible about life up until, fairly recently, really. It was not uncommon if you had 10 children, and that was not that uncommon. It was not uncommon for the great majority of them to die, or certainly at least a third of them. Every place you looked, people had a child that died, or two, or three, or four. My next door neighbor, when we lived in Long Beach, our next door neighbor had 16 children. She came from the Philippines, and she had 16 children. 5 died. They were living a little more like the older days in some ways than we do here. But if you look around here, if you ask around, there's not that many people that have actually had a child die. It happens, obviously, but it's not the disease and everything else, despite the pandemic and all this. We have it better than anybody ever had it in any time in history. Not just in this country, but in the world. Even in the places that are very poor, it's in many ways it's better there than it was under the kings and emperors 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. So anyway, we know that Joseph was a carpenter. If he was a carpenter, he had a skill. He wasn't out begging for money because he had a skill. That was a valued skill. So it's just good to know. In many ways, Jesus was probably born into a family very much like your own. So something to think about too. For somebody else it would look different, but I'm just saying he really became one of us. And anyway, something to think about. Let's see. To put some stuff in response. Anything in here that might have got you thinking, think about it a little bit and then put your response and tell me what you're thinking. I've left these responses at 10 minutes. You can use those whole 10 minutes if you want. I am more than happy to hear anything you have to say. I will listen to every single one. And if you ever ask me a question, you can always send it to the email confirmation@whitestonejournal.com. Okay, whoop, right there. And anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Sorry about the glitchy things there. I messed up a little bit, but hey, it's but I got it done. It's Sunday night. The class has to be available tomorrow morning, and I'm back doing it last minute again. So if you're having a hard time getting your projects for school done, or your homework's done a little bit late, or you're barely getting it done and you're up to 1 in the morning working on it, I'm right there with you, because it'll be at least 1 in the morning before I finish preparing this class. Anyway, I love you all very much. I hope that you are having a good Advent, have a good week, and we're hoping that we'll have a class in person in January. We'll see how that works. It depends a lot on what happens in the world at that time. All right. Thanks an awful lot for joining, and I'll talk to you soon.